Okay, now we're back. So, what we had at this point is a linear regression of log quantity against log price, which would get us an estimated elasticity of negative 0.493. However, our understanding of principles of micro is such that we know that we shouldn't interpret this as the slope of the demand curve, because part of what's going into this is also the supply curve. Okay, so fortunately, what we have with us here are some variables that should only really affect affect the supply curve in this market, which are the speed, wave, speed 2 and wave 2 variables. I'll just use those for this example. And so we can estimate an instrumental variables model using these two as instruments for price. Okay, now to do this we need to use one of Stata's other commands. So one could use the IV regress command, so while I encourage you to have a look at the help file yourself, I don't think I'm going to quickly be able to get this up into into something readable on the screen. So remember, you can always Google Stata commands like this: Stata IV regress. Okay, in fact, here we get the file from the manual. I found online they're generally a little bit more useful than the ones that come with Stata, usually because they've got a few more examples. Okay, so we're going to use a two-stage least squares estimator with the same dependent variable and independent variable, but now, well, it's not really an independent variable because it's an endogenous variable. So we're going to have to tell it to use some of these fishing conditions variables as instruments for price. Okay, so I'm just going to pull up the syntax here. I'm going to copy that into my do file editor so I can see what's going on here. Okay, that didn't work out very well. Okay, if I wrap lines, it's probably going to be easier for you to see. My students are always telling me to do that. Okay, so we're going to have, let's get this set up. Okay, there's the description from Stata. Let's see if we can code this thing up. So we start with IV regress, dependent variable, so that's what we had before, log quantity, and then, well, we want to have a variable that we're instrumenting, so we've got log price, and we're using a couple of these variables over here. Let's use speed 2 and wave 2 as instruments for price. Okay, so wind speed and wave height are going to be our instruments for log price. Okay, so if we run that, LQ not valid. Let's see what the problem is there. Okay, I worked out what it was. It's saying LQ is not a valid estimator. So if I'm looking at the syntax here, IV regress estimator dependent variable, I've got IV regress dependent variable, I've missed the estimator. So going back to the help file here, the estimator I want to use is two-stage least squares. So I need to type that in between, and then hopefully it will work. Two-stage least squares. Something's worked there. I can't see it on the screen at the moment, and it's looking bad here, so I'm just going to add that to my STAB table so we can look at it a little bit more clearly. Okay, so esto, column 2, and that should be enough to get it into my STAB table. Okay, so note here that we've got a negative number. This is our estimate for the elasticity of demand using instrumental variables. And remember, this number should be negative because we're estimating a demand curve. But what's interesting here is that it's more negative. Okay, so sometimes when you do instrumental variables, I mean, especially with demand, if you think about it, if most of the relationship between price and quantity is driven by shifts in demand, then you should get a positive number here. But if only a little bit of it is due to shifts in demand, then this number should be more positive, but maybe not positive itself, right? It should be closer to zero or maybe positive, depending on how much of a demand shift you've got happening in your data. Okay, but if we take out those demand shifts by using instruments that could only be affecting supply shifts, then we've got a change in our estimate going from OLS to instrumental variables that is in the right direction, right? If the OLS estimator is sort of not able to tell the difference between a shift in supply and shift in demand, then we're going to get a few shifts in demand here that are messing up our estimator. Whereas over here, this is, I mean, if you believe the assumptions, this is going to be a better estimate of the elasticity of demand. Okay, so what our results here are showing is that demand is more elastic than OLS would have you believe. Okay, and I'm just going to finish up this video by showing you a little bit about how to make this STAB table look a bit nicer. So for one thing, I can't, just by looking at the table, I can't tell which one of these is OLS and which one is IV. So I can do this by giving STAB a little bit more information. So let's say est add local model OLS, and then down here est add local model IV, and then down here I can have scalars model. If I run that, okay, I can't have that because model is already defined, so let's call it capital M. It's not going to have a problem with that. Okay, so now my table is showing me OLS instrumental variables, so I know which column is which. Some other things you might be interested in, you could export this as a rich text format, so you can copy and paste it into Word if that is your thing. So you could have using fish.rtf, then you're going to want to replace here so that when you run the code twice it doesn't give you an error message. So now here's the table that's generated by this line here, and then if I go down it says, well, I've generated an STAB table here using RTF. I can now go and click on that, and if my computer is willing to wake up fast enough, it's going to open that up in Word. Okay, so just wait for that. And then, oh, here we go. So there's the table nicely formatted for Word. Okay. The other things that we could be doing here, let's see, I need to get back to my, where's my Stata window? Back here. Okay, so the other things we've got here, we could think about using the variable labels, right? So here we've got LQ, I don't really know what that means. Okay, but I assigned variable labels up here, call LQ log quantity, and so on. So I could use the label option in STAB. I'll put it in both of these. And I can start using the variable labels. This will also use value labels if you've got those in there as well. Okay, so I know I've got log quantity on the left-hand side and log price on the right-hand side, and instead of this silly underscore constant const we had before, we now know it's a constant. Okay, so there are a few things you can do with stab, how you can estimate a basic instrumental or two-stage least squares regression. Hope you have found this interesting and learned something. Depending on child constraints and so on, I may be posting more of these. I'm James Bland. Have a good one.